Good morning. Thank you actually for the organizer for me to allow me to be here, and I very much would like to share with you some information that I hope will be of benefit to the audience. Good morning to everyone who come from different places to this wonderful city, Hong Kong. And I have chosen a picture of Hong Kong with this title because I wanted to quickly share with you some very, I think, very useful points that will be hopefully relevant to the audience here. We have come a long way. We have come a long way because we are going to be actually talking about China. We are talking about the changes. We are going to really look at the changes and see whether we can draw lessons and information from the past and the present, and hopefully guide us for the future. China came from a very, very, very heavy past. It was more than 40 years ago, China went through a traumatic cultural revolution. It was the cultural revolution in China that made the mainland Chinese very different from the Chinese in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Macau, and in other countries. That's where China came from. But last year, Shanghai staged the first Victoria's Secret show, and the models from China obviously dominated the attention of the people. The Little Red Book, after 40 years, has now become the name of a famous social media, no longer referring to the Little Red Book of 40 years ago. That's the change China went through. In the 80s, Hong Kong was a place leading fashion for Chinese. We remember the landscape of 40 years ago. We Chinese were oceans apart. Hong Kong Chinese, Taiwan Chinese, Singaporean Chinese, Macau Chinese, Chinese overseas, versus the Chinese in China, who were hungry, thirsty, and definitely looking very, very different. We are talking about fashion. Fashion is about how people look, how people maybe dress, but it's a reflection of how people really are and a lot of other things that is more substantial. That's where we came from 40 years ago. Now, we remember also Hong Kong was the place that led fashion for all Chinese. Remember all those faces in the 1980s. Of course, 40 years after, Lisa, Alan, Maggie, and Jackie still look very good. But about a month ago, Oxford Dictionary adopted the Chinese word 加油 as a word that needs no translation. And I think this is what Hong Kong needs as well. Hong Kong needs 加油 because I think we also need a little bit more useful energy that I think was representing Hong Kong before and not as much today. China, on the other hand, had really literally fashion transformed. You remember the days of China when the whole city of Shanghai and Beijing were just a sea of blue and gray. China actually invented unisex before Calvin Klein. And in fact, those were the days of Chinese looking so distinctively mainland Chinese that you could spot them from far away in the street of Hong Kong. In the last 10 years, China literally had changed. Since about 2009, 2010, China literally had gone through a generational shift. Today, I don't think you can spot a mainland Chinese student so easily. We are talking about young Chinese. And in fact, the pop culture in China is now dominated by people who are barely in their 20s. And we have all those faces that are no longer from outside China, but from within China. That's the change that China had gone through. And it's a fashion change indeed, without any doubt. There was a moment in the 1980s, Teresa Tan from Taiwan was actually singing in Cantonese. There were the memories of the four heavenly kings from Hong Kong who started to sing in Mandarin. And of course, all this has changed. Now, of course, we have Chinese stars, Chinese celebrities from all those places in Greater China who are singing in Mandarin, but also mixed with English. This is how China is changing. The Chinese fashion is not about being Chinese. The Chinese fashion is actually about being international. This is what we see, and fashion really reflects the reality of what's going on in China, driven by the changes of mainland Chinese. China literally has gone very international. In the last 40 years, a lot of Chinese students had gone overseas. But at the beginning, the Chinese students were going overseas with a one-way ticket. People leaving China, not thinking of going back. But today, no exception, everybody is on two-way ticket. Not only on two-way ticket, statistically for the last 40 years, more than 83% of the mainland Chinese gone overseas have returned to work and live in China. And that's the cumulative 40 years. If you're looking at the last 5, I bet it's probably more than 95% of the mainland Chinese students going overseas and returning. And not even that. They stay connected. They do not lose the contact with motherland. And in fact, most of them, almost all of them, are actually determined to go back. And they're not only on two-way ticket, they're probably going back and forth at least 2-3 times a year. So that's the change of China. And that also contributes to the internationalized fashion sense of Chinese people, especially the young people. Now, in China, the phenomenon of key opinion leaders, the KOLs, are obviously very evident, influences on fashion. But when you look closely, almost all of them, as I said before, educated overseas. It's the new generation of Chinese youths, educated and exposed overseas and mixing what they see overseas with the connections in China and becoming more and more influential. And not just influential to the peers, influential also in terms of reverse mentoring, teaching, guiding their parents' generation what to buy, what to wear, and what to do. And very effectively, because the parents' generation have basically accepted the fact that the children know better, much, much better than their own sense of beauty, fashion, etc., etc. So this is a phenomenon that is very unique because of the background of China. China has now finally got an emerged middle class, arguably hundreds of millions. Some people will put it at 300 million, but at minimum, 110 million maybe. But the uniqueness of the Chinese middle class is the fact that they are young. They are all young, 110 million people in their 20s and 30s versus maybe 100 million middle-class people in Japan who are relatively old, versus the 100 million middle-class people in the United States who are not as happy and doing less well than their parents, versus probably 100 million European middle class, which a little bit less affluent or doing not as well in terms of upwardly mobile ability in terms of consumption. So the passion, the strength of this middle class has everything to do with fashion, with the useful interest in fashion, which is very, very important. Now, because of the international connection, we observe there's now very much increased movement of internationalized localism. The movies in China, the hot ones, are mostly local, not necessarily meaning anything or everything to people outside China, but they are the dominant part of the local culture now. Also, there's now not just a quick wholesale adoption of international things. In China, there's also a localized internationalism. China's got rap, yes, but it's Chinese rap. China is into street dance, but it's not the copy or just the wholesale adoption of whatever's going on outside. It's a Chinese version of street dance. All this is really very, very important. The risen confidence also has now contributed to a phenomenon of rebranding of local culture. You know, the hit dramas in costume drama this summer. You also need to know that actually only for 3 years, a period of 3 years, the reintroduction of Qixi as the Chinese Valentine's Day has become 3 times or a few times bigger than the Western Valentine's Day as celebration and gifting since only 2016. So all this rebranding of Chinese culture is, again, a very strong reflection of risen self-confidence. China has gone a long way. I took this picture just about a year ago at a river dividing Hong Kong and Shenzhen. You know that Shenzhen used to be a fishing village of less than or about 30,000 people. 40 years ago, people in China traveled days because there was no road to get to the border, and many of them even attempted to try to escape into Hong Kong. Today, it's unthinkable. Not only that, we know as a fact that actually Shenzhen's economy, as a city economy, is already rivaling, if not more than, Hong Kong's. And in fact, in China, probably now have at least 5 cities that have GDPs bigger or equal to Hong Kong's. While 1990, Hong Kong, a little city economy, represented the equivalent of 20% of the whole of China's economy. China has gone a long way to have grown. It's not that Hong Kong is not growing, it's the mainland has become bigger and bigger. So this relativity has changed a lot of things, and perspectives included, and it's a reflection of how this whole world of Greater China and the people in it have changed. And also, of course, contributing to the sense of change that is fashion. China is not just about fashion of how to dress and look. It's about the fashion of how to live, how to work, and how to do business. There was a time businesses were based on connections. That was not too long ago. And also it benefited Hong Kong. Don't forget CITIC also extended itself into Hong Kong in its early days. There was a time that China's business was driven by youthful passion, energy, but no experience. Again, Hong Kong was looked up to because Shenzhen was the next door experiment, learning from Hong Kong. Real estate was the business. But China has changed. China has moved forward. In the last 10 years, China has gone beyond that. We have now so-called middle-aged wisdom, which did not exist before. And it's a generation of Chinese who grew up in the last 40 years, coming from no experience, gaining experience and wisdom, and guiding themselves into more visionary business development. We have seen all this revolution or evolution or revolutionary evolution, if you will, that is actually unfolded just in mainland China and impacting the whole of Greater China as well. China, the economy shifts, and it has done many shifts. There was a time the GDP was driven by government investment, maybe export, but 2014, 2015, we saw a shift in consumption, moving away from gifting, self-gifting, public expensed consumption towards something that is more normal. We have succeeded. This transition has succeeded, in fact, so much that some people have already forgotten that we transited. For every single customer that was old-fashioned public consumption that we may have lost, we gained 100 more new normal consumers. That was one completed transition. But we are also in a new, probably, transition, that is the divided contribution of private businesses versus the government-owned economy. It's a different transition. It may be a very different shift. It will never be a complete shift one overtaking the other. But it's very important to read, to understand, to hear about the government support, the President Xi himself supporting the private economy of China. Private economy of China is gaining momentum in ways that are so evident. Today, we think about Chinese business people, we can only think of private enterprises. The face of Chinese entrepreneurship is no longer about connections. It's about innovation. It may be in the past, there was this idea of copying, but we are also seeing a lot of prospects and a lot of examples of worldly innovation. The change in China is extraordinary, and then when you look at the age of the young Chinese entrepreneurs, you cannot help but being impressed. China is no longer about just manufacturing. China is not about real estate anymore. China is really about something more interesting and, in fact, leading a lot of development in businesses globally. China is always looking for inspiration from Hong Kong. And we will never forget what this Mr. Jin Yong or Mr. Cha had contributed. And all this started in Hong Kong. And even after years and decades, let's not forget, Alibaba Group, Mr. Jack Ma, has been always very inspired by Jin Yong's fictions. And in fact, I understand that many of the executives in Alibaba Group have adopted nicknames from the fictionary stories of Jin Yong. So all this is really interesting because Hong Kong certainly has a relevance that is long-lasting and the inspiration that lives with even today's China in the technological advancement that we all embrace. China youth technology is very important. The whole of China, as we know, is digitalized more than many other places. More than many places, almost more than all places in Greater China, I would say. And all this is something that we need to understand. It's also about how fashion works. Again, it's not just about dress and look, it's about a reflection of what's going on. And we know that this is something that is really fast moving forward in China. China is also such a place that it's easy to think of China from Hong Kong and say, that's the north. No, China is actually many, many Chinas, if I may. In fact, major cities in China, each is probably an equivalent of a developed European country in terms of economy. The faces of China for consumption have changed from relatively old to now very young and very international, as we know. So all this is related to how we think about China and how we understand the Chinese consumers and how we try to think about the context of fashion. Now, fashion also relates to how people live and travel. You know the mainland Chinese are traveling more and more, 140 million visits made probably this year, and you have a lot of people online, you have a lot of shopping overseas, and of course you have many, many different images of Chinese traveling, some of which maybe still go back to relatively old-fashioned and older-aged, but let's not forget, a rising force, a dominant force, a very important force of change and related to fashion is the youth. Of course, youth is part of that traveling that is also changing as well. So we need to understand and be aware of this. Speaking of youth, at the beginning of this year, actually we're now ending 2018, on the New Year's Day of 2018, in mainland China, everybody was on WeChat sharing their photos when they were 18. Why? Because this is the year that yet another wave of millennials turning 18. There's no shortage of new waves of youth coming into the picture. You are to be reminded that actually today, 50% of the entire mainland Chinese population have been born since 1980. And that's not it. because the oldest of which is already turning 38, so pushing almost 40. So we are now all talking about the post-1995 generation, which in total also comes up to be something like 320 million. So size matters, scale matters, and China is a place that has such a size that anything that China does has an impact, not just on Greater China, but also on the world. China is moving so fast, we need to be reminded that sometimes Hollywood views of China are a little bit less sort of updated. We often have incidents of good intentions of trying to maybe appeal to the Chinese in mainland China that are actually thought of as really outdated. The old images of colonial China, or the Chinatown China, or the little rich Asian Chinese that actually are Singaporeans, but not really mainland Chinese, but it doesn't matter, good intentions. But there's a lot of catching up because things really move so fast, you cannot blink. If you blink, you will miss it, because China is not a place that actually you visit once and you come back and write a book and you think you understand, because things just get changed very, very fast. We are 40 years after when China opened up. China has changed. China has certainly changed. Hong Kong has changed. Taiwan has changed. And now we are in a universe that because we have all changed and China has caught up, we are beginning to think and look more and more like each other. And when you look at the celebrities sort of popular in our market, it's difficult to tell which one is from where, but we know which one is from where. There's this unification by fashion that is having an influence, a very positive one. China is still changing, and everyone else now needs to adapt and change and adjust. This is a moment that we really need to pay attention. The world of Greater China is getting closer, whether it's by high-speed rail or by the bridge. We are getting closer. We are getting closer. It does not mean that the people in different sectors or cities or territories in Greater China are the same, because there's a different past. There's a different past. So all this is something that is a challenge, but it's a challenge that still is very much driven by the passion of the mainland Chinese looking for change. Mainland Chinese are no longer thirsty and hungry, but still very, very passionate. I took this picture of Pudong from the Bugri Hotel in Shanghai, looking at Pudong. Remember, that was a piece of land that was totally flat before 1990. This is now a symbol of modernity, Pudong, Shanghai. China is not all blue skies, but symbolized by this new champion of Chinese track and field sports, China still is full of youthful energy and passion. And this is where the world will benefit from: China and fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wu. Can I invite you to sit down with me? And we're going to have a Q&A session. I think the audience can also submit their questions by scanning the code, and then you can submit your questions and I'll read them here now. So the first question is from the audience. Thank you for that. That was really insightful. Made me think of my youth of Chinese canto pop and my youth here in Hong Kong. First question, how can the fashion industry benefit from the One Belt, One Road project, and what effect do you think that will have on the industry globally?
One Belt, One Road is not a B2C project. Mm-hmm. It's still an infrastructure building. To me, it's a B2B project to start. Eventually, maybe it will become a B2C influence. When we talk about fashion today, from my viewpoint, it's all about B2C. It's about influence on the consumers. It's not about manufacturing. If we're talking about manufacturing, then we're talking about textile industry. We're talking about factories. I think today, when we are looking at fashion, when we are looking at the context of China, when we are looking at the Chinese movement or influence on the world, it's beyond the manufacturing. It's certainly beyond infrastructure. It's all about consumer, so therefore, it's about B2C. So I would not immediately be able to comment on what this One Belt, One Road sort of project or scheme in relationship to fashion.
Yeah. Okay. The next question is, do you see any similarities or differences between the way luxury is consumed in China and the rest of Asia?
First of all, the luxury in consumption in China with the rest of the world, not just Asia, is probably most visible in terms of difference is about the youth engagement. Luxury consumers in China probably are 15, 20 years younger than the average luxury consumers overseas. So that's already very different. The passion, I think. Luxury consumption, let me just also add a point. Luxury consumption is always dominated by Asian consumers. Let's not forget. Yeah. So Chinese consumers is part of the Asian consumption. It's not like it's suddenly you have a phenomenon of Chinese consuming luxury. It's Asians dominating consumption of luxury, Chinese participating, and the scale of China is so big, and of course, probably the energy and the motivation and the pent-up demand. So you have a lot of other reasons that make Chinese more pronounced, more outstanding, and bigger. But let's not forget the Asian context. Now, Chinese in China versus other Asians. Well, the size. And of course, the background. I will always want to remind people that the Cultural Revolution, the deprivation in China prior to China's opening probably contributed and introduced new genes to the Chinese DNA that made the mainland Chinese different, whether they realize it or not. The older generation do, the younger generation may not, but it does not mean that they don't carry the genes. So, you see, I think this is interesting. So I think that probably is a difference, but let's not get too carried away with that. Rather, I would say it's the scale of China that made Chinese in China different from the rest of Asia.
Yeah. Okay, and this is an interesting question. What are some problems that need to be solved in order to move the Chinese fashion industry forward? I think it's probably a very big topic, so maybe you could signal out maybe 2 or 3 areas that you feel need to be improved.
I don't have answers to necessarily to satisfy maybe whoever that asked this question, but I want to point out something. It's very tempting to approach developing local brands the way that you want to immediately become a celebrated brand. Yeah. And oftentimes forgetting that brand needs to be nurtured. It's B2C, so it's not wholesale to a government or something that is institution. It's connecting with the consumers. So the right approach is always looking at, are you gaining customers, rather than, can I win an award? Okay, you could win an award, but with no customers. Yeah. So who are you going to sell it? You would think that winning an award is automatically going to be sort of connecting with the customers. That will be wrong. I think if you look at the roots, look at how brands develop from unknown to known, it's not like they are winning an award. I'm sure if you go back and think about famous brands like Louis Vuitton and Christian Dior or Chanel or Hermes, they started very humbly. They were making trunks, they were making dresses, but for a certain customer base, and they grow their customer base. So this is how brands develop. So shouting Asian or Chinese is not necessarily going to, in fact, it doesn't attract necessarily the consumer's interest. I think it's very important for China, for instance, I can speak. Chinese consumers are patriotic, but they are not going to buy you because, oh, you are shouting Chinese. We have plenty of international brands that have Chinese names. Shanghai 10, is that a Chinese brand? Mm-hmm. Jimmy Choo is Chinese, but it's not a Chinese brand, right? So I don't think it's the title or the slogan, it's the connection. So I think it's the connecting with consumers is the approach, and the answer lies there. So you need to look at who is connecting with the Chinese consumers, local brands, and how are they growing from small to medium to big. Yeah. So it's a process. It's agriculture.
Yeah. But also I think it's important for a lot of Chinese designers to also, you know, capture the domestic consumer. I think, do you still see a problem with a lot of Chinese designers wanting to be international first and then ignoring the domestic market?
Nothing wrong if you are a Chinese designer and you capture a Parisian customer base. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with a Chinese designer capturing American audience. As long as you are very clear who you are going after. You could be a Chinese designer, make yourself a success in the US, selling to Americans, which is fine. I think it's when you are confused, then it's an issue. You are talking to an audience thinking you are selling to the others. Well, the proof will be in the pudding. Are you succeeding in selling to the others? Mm-hmm. It's not a theory. Mm-hmm. I think it's really in the practice. Yeah. It's the key thing is, are you consumer-centric? Or are you just thinking of winning an award? Yeah. So that's a different. Yeah. You could win an award, which could lead you to be a designer for some brands. That's a different approach. But if you want to build your brand, you need to connect with consumers. Whoever they are, wherever they are, you need to have a consumer base that you are connecting with.
Another question. You spoke a lot about Hong Kong's influence on China before and how that's evolved. And so this question's interesting. It's how should Hong Kong move forward as a city of culture, and how should we position ourselves? I presume this means fashion culture specifically.
Hong Kong has had a major role in China's transformation for the last 40 years. Hong Kong will continue to have a major role to play, but Hong Kong needs to understand China. Hong Kong needs to connect China, and Hong Kong youth need to wake up. Because Hong Kong cannot live in the past, as China could not live in the past. Mm-hmm. China should not and does not. China moves on. And the world needs to live with youth. Fashion industry in particular needs to depend on youth, youthful energy. It was about 61 years ago, Mao said, the world belongs to you and me, but more belong to youth. Yeah. So Hong Kong, I think, also rightly so, belongs to Hong Kong's youth. Yeah. So China was waking up 40 years ago. Look at China now. Yeah. Hong Kong cannot go to sleep. Yeah. Hong Kong need to stay awake.
Just onto this topic of youth, which was interesting because you spoke about the middle class in China, the millennials. Who are the next, kind of desirable group of consumers, and how are they going to be different from, the millennials or the previous ones before them in terms of what they want, what they're going to buy?
I think it's very difficult to predict, but I think staying engaged is probably the name of the game. Retail is the essence of luxury industry, for instance. Without getting into so retail-centric, we would not have the luxury industry the way it has become today. So staying alert and engaged in retail allows you to see things not on a wholesale basis, only when things become big, but on a daily basis to feel the pulse of the change. I think change is difficult to predict, but change needs to be monitored on a daily basis. And of course, staying awake and staying alert is not just advice for Hong Kong. It's something that we all have to do as industry, as companies, as people working in industries. And retail allows you to do that because every day you will know whether you are doing well or not. Mm-hmm. It's not the intentions, it's the proof. It's the ping pong game you play with the consumers on a daily basis rather than, oh, you do something wholesale and you walk away and then hoping that it will sell or not. So I think this is that mentality is probably what will help for people to understand what's going to happen. You have to really stay engaged because there's nothing as sort of a theory or something that you can just predict and you walk away because things really change. I think we need to be prepared for the unknown and we need to really sort of adjust ourselves to change.
Okay, well, I think we've got time for one more question. What's your expectations for the economy next year in China and Hong Kong, especially with regards to the luxury sector?
Not for me to predict. I think everybody is reading newspapers. I think the world is getting more complicated, and of course, macroeconomic challenges are plenty. But I think the key thing that I would say is that there was a period China was growing double-digit, and you have a big tide that carries everyone. But that is gone. It's a differentiated world. You cannot expect to be carried up by GDP growth, which is now single-digit in China, which is only normal when the size of the economy has already become the number 2 in the world and is still growing at a really decent pace. China, by the way, is growing even at 6% Holland every year. So that's big. Yeah. For big brands, it's similar. So in that sense, it's more of a sophisticated approach, more connecting with the consumers rather than just dependent on the macroeconomic growth to carry you. So I think it's that. I'm very positive the world is going in a better direction. China is getting more sophisticated. It's going into quality growth rather than just quantity growth. It's more concerned about environment. It's more concerned about quality of life, quality of products. All these are very positive moves. China is also moving up in the value chain. Yeah, you are losing labor advantage, but who wants to be a cheap labor when you want to move up? So obviously, there's always the other side. So it's a much more complicated environment we are living with, but we are better off than before.
So that's a positive thing.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Wu, for your insights. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you.